Imagine North America in the year 1763. There is no United States, no American flag, no president. Instead, along the eastern coast, 13 distinct British colonies stretch from New England down to the southern plantations. The people living there speak English, trade under British law, and consider themselves proud, loyal subjects of King George III. This map displays newly secured British domains following the 7 Years' War. Britain emerged victorious, claiming the massive stretch of territory east of the Mississippi River, shown here. But victory came with an enormous price tag. The British government had accumulated massive debts to finance the war. Since British troops had fought across frontier settlements to defend these lands, leaders in London believed the colonies should help pay for the army that protected them. To officials in London, the request was a matter of simple arithmetic. That this financial calculus created a vacuum of understanding between the two sides, triggering a sequence of events that would dismantle the empire's control over America. This map details the proclamation line of 1763 along the Appalachian boundary. King George III limited Western settlement to avoid costly frontier wars. But to colonists, this boundary meant lost opportunity. Veterans and farmers expected land, but found this massive territory legally locked away. This one-penny tax stamp from the 1765 Stamp Act required colonial printed materials to carry a stamp for revenue. But the issue was representation. Parliament imposed taxes on people with no elected representatives in London, a new bureaucratic reach into daily colonial life. The reaction on the ground was immediate. Merchants organized widespread boycotts of British goods. Groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty formed to orchestrate opposition. Public demonstrations erupted in the streets, effectively paralyzing colonial administration. It is a crucial distinction that in 1765, these protesters were not seeking independence. They still considered themselves loyal British subjects, demanding what they believed were their traditional rights as Englishmen. By attempting to balance its imperial ledger, the British government had inadvertently awakened a highly organized colonial political resistance. London repealed the Stamp Act, but passed the Declaratory Act, asserting Parliament held absolute authority to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The debate over taxes evolved into a collision over the right to govern. Did local assemblies or a distant parliament hold supreme jurisdiction? In 1767, the Townshend Acts placed duties on imported goods, triggering a second wave of defiance. The friction was becoming permanent. To force compliance, London deployed armed troops to occupy the streets of Boston. Living under military occupation created an atmosphere of constant suspicion. Every argument between a civilian and a soldier carried the potential for escalation. That escalation occurred on a cold March evening in 1770. A confrontation between British soldiers and a crowd in Boston ended with 5 colonists killed. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. Colonial leaders used images of the shooting as evidence that British authority had become dangerous. The presence of military force made it increasingly difficult to view the conflict as a mere legal disagreement over trade and taxes. Despite the violence, the colonies in the early 1770s remained divided by geography, religion, and local interests. A unified American identity did not yet exist. But as this map visualizes, the shared trauma of military occupation and the collective effort of economic boycotts began to draw the colonies together. They were beginning to see themselves as part of a larger American cause. This unity was fragile. Many loyalists actively resisted the growing rebellion, and the prospect of total independence was still considered a radical outlier. It would take one final confrontation to push the colonies toward open rebellion. In 1773, a shipment of heavily taxed tea arrived in Boston. The resulting Boston Tea Party transformed a political dispute into a crisis from which neither the British Empire nor its American colonies could easily retreat. By tightening its grip over a decade to maintain its empire, Britain had inadvertently built the exact unified machine that would destroy it. Imagine America in the year 1763. If you look closely, you will find no United States. There is no American flag, no president sitting in Washington, and almost no one talking about independence. Instead, the eastern coast of North America is home to 13 distinct colonies. They are divided by geography, religion, and local economic interests. The main things holding them together are a shared language, their loyalty to King George III, and the relief of having just won a major global conflict alongside Britain, the 7 Years' War. But that victory came with a massive price tag. Britain emerged from the war with enormous debts. From London's perspective, British troops and British taxpayers had just secured the North American continent. The government firmly believed the American colonists should help finance the military protection they had received. The American Revolution began in the mundane world of ledgers and balance sheets. Before anyone argued for independence, they argued over how to pay off a global war debt. This map shows the British colonies in 1763. The red boundary drawn down the Appalachian Mountains is the Proclamation Line. To stabilize the frontier and limit military costs, the British government used this line to block colonists from settling further west. For farmers and veterans expecting new land as a reward for their wartime service, the boundary represented a loss of opportunity. Following the land restrictions, Britain introduced direct methods for raising revenue. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, followed by the Stamp Act. These red one-penny stamps seen here had to be purchased and applied to almost every piece of printed material in the colonies, including legal contracts and newspapers. The colonists pushed back immediately. While they had supplied soldiers for the empire in the past, they maintained that only their local elected assemblies held the legal authority to impose internal taxes. Because they had no representatives in the Parliament in London, they viewed these new acts as a breach of their rights. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," challenged the legal mechanics of the empire. By questioning the right of a distant parliament to levy taxes, the colonies were directly contesting London's authority to govern their internal affairs. To combat the Stamp Act, colonial resistance organized rapidly. Merchants formed agreements to boycott British goods, and groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty took to the streets, demanding their traditional rights as English subjects be respected. This front page of the New Hampshire Gazette from October 1765 shows how the printing press was used to incite resistance. Publishers used heavy black borders and the skull and crossbones imagery highlighted here to signal that the Stamp Act was a fatal threat to colonial liberty. The economic pressure worked, and Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. But in the exact same breath, they passed the Declaratory Act. This new law stated that Parliament retained absolute authority to make laws for the American colonies in all cases whatsoever. British leaders intended to reassert their dominance. Instead, they convinced the colonists that their local assemblies and their political autonomy were under a severe existential threat. The cycle repeated itself in 1767 when Parliament introduced the Townshend Acts, placing new duties on imported everyday goods like glass, lead, paint, and paper. The colonial response was driven by entire communities. Ordinary people refused to buy British imports, and women took on a vital political role by spinning their own homespun cloth to ensure the boycott survived. Faced with this growing unrest, British officials escalated the conflict by flooding the city of Boston with armed soldiers. The presence of a standing army in a major commercial hub created a toxic environment between the locals and the troops. On the cold evening of March 5, 1770, those tensions snapped. A street argument near the Boston Custom House spiraled into chaos. Objects were thrown at the soldiers, weapons were raised, and the British fired directly into the civilian crowd. 5 colonists were killed, including Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and indigenous descent. The event immediately became known as the Boston Massacre. After March 5, 1770, the debate moved beyond trade duties and import taxes. The presence of 5 dead colonists in the snow framed the British military presence as a literal threat to colonial lives. Colonial leaders recognized the political power of those 5 deaths. Silversmith Paul Revere produced a highly sensationalized engraving of British soldiers slaughtering innocent civilians, and that propaganda spread across the continent. To keep outrage organized, communities established the Committees of Correspondence. This rapid intercolonial communication system bypassed British censors. Because of this infrastructure, an argument in Massachusetts could immediately inspire debate in Virginia, helping isolated regions forge a shared continental identity. That newly connected network was put to the test in 1773 when Parliament passed the Tea Act. The law allowed the struggling British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a lower price, but colonists recognized it as a political trap. Buying the cheap tea meant silently accepting Parliament's legal authority to tax them. When 3 ships carrying company tea refused to leave Boston Harbor, the resistance took physical action. In December 1773, thousands gathered, boarded the ships, and systematically destroyed the cargo, throwing hundreds of chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was a deliberate, spectacular destruction of corporate property. Tossing the tea crossed a critical line for both sides, transforming a prolonged debate over legal rights into an active rebellion from which neither the Crown nor the colonies could easily retreat. Leaders in London were furious. They believed the authority of the entire empire was collapsing, and they responded in 1774 with a series of aggressive laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The legislation was designed to punish Massachusetts. Boston Harbor was closed to trade until the destroyed tea was paid for, and the colony's political system and judicial procedures were restricted by the military. The British strategy relied on a specific assumption. They believed that by crushing Boston, they would isolate the radicals and terrify the other 12 colonies into quiet submission. This was a fatal geopolitical miscalculation. Instead of alienating Massachusetts, the punishment proved to every other colony that their own local governments were vulnerable. If Britain could unilaterally strip away the rights of Boston, no colony was safe. The continent responded with unity. Colonies shipped food and supplies overland to relieve the blockaded city of Boston, and in September 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia to form the First Continental Congress. While the politicians debated their legal options in Philadelphia, regular citizens began preparing for the worst. Across New England, colonists organized local militias, gathering muskets and quietly stockpiling ammunition in the countryside. In April 1775, British commanders marched toward the towns of Lexington and Concord to seize those weapons and restore order. When the two sides met, the first shots were fired, and 12 years of mounting tension finally erupted into open war. The United States was born as the unintended consequence of a 12-year escalation loop. From a disagreement over war debt to the arrival of troops and the closing of ports, every British attempt to reassert control pushed 13 divided colonies into a single revolutionary force. Imagine America in the year 1763. There is no United States, no American flag, no president sitting in Washington. If you asked the people living along the eastern coast of North America who they were, they would call themselves subjects of King George III. Look at this 1763 map of North America. The 13 colonies, stretching from New England down to the southern plantations, were economically integrated outposts of the British Empire. They spoke English, traded under British law, and thrived within a global imperial system. That loyalty was earned through blood. For 9 years, British colonists and soldiers had fought side by side against French forces and their indigenous allies in the 7 Years' War. They shared the same trenches and celebrated the same victory. By 1763, the colonial populations celebrated the massive expansion of the empire, viewing themselves as the primary beneficiaries of a shared British victory. Victory, however, came with a massive price tag. Britain emerged from the 7 Years' War with enormous debts, leading leaders in London to conclude that the colonies should contribute to the cost of their own defense. These rows of red stamps represent the turning point. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, requiring newspapers, legal documents, and licenses to carry one of these official marks. It followed the Sugar Act as a direct effort to extract revenue from the colonies. Colonists saw this as a violation of a fundamental right. They had already supplied soldiers and resources for the war, and they believed that taxation required direct political representation, a right they lacked in the Parliament thousands of miles away. Resistance spread through the press. Look at this front page of the New Hampshire Gazette from October 1765. Newspapers attacked the policy. Merchants organized boycotts, and public demonstrations erupted in cities like Boston. In 1765, the goalpost was clear. The colonists fought to retain their traditional rights as Englishmen, seeking control over their own internal taxation. While Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, they simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act. This law asserted their absolute authority to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever, signaling that the debate had moved beyond mere finance. New taxes under the Townshend Act scarred, along with the arrival of British troops in Boston. The presence of a standing army in a civilian city created an atmosphere of suspicion, turning political disagreements into a physical standoff. On March 5, 1770, that tension exploded. A chaotic confrontation between a crowd and British soldiers ended with 5 colonists dead in the street. Colonial leaders branded the event a massacre. Paul Revere produced this engraving to ensure the story reached the colonies. He depicted the soldiers as a coordinated firing squad attacking unarmed civilians. A powerful image, convincing others that British military power was an active threat. The struggle had transitioned into a fight over military overreach and the future of colonial liberty. Quietly, the colonies began building a shared political conversation. Through committees of correspondence, communities could now communicate rapidly, ensuring that a protest in Massachusetts became a subject of debate in Virginia. In 1773, that communication network focused on the Tea Act. In a direct challenge to British authority, protesters in Boston boarded ships and destroyed hundreds of chests of tea, throwing them into the harbor. Parliament responded with the Intolerable Acts. They closed Boston Harbor and dismantled the Massachusetts government, intending to crush local resistance through severe punishment. The plan backfired. Instead of retreating, other colonies sent aid to Boston and organized the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. By attacking the rights of one colony, Britain turned a local Massachusetts dispute into a unified continental crisis. The tipping point arrived in April 1775. British troops marched toward Concord to seize militia weapons, but they were met at Lexington by local farmers and tradesmen. The exchange of gunfire resulted in the first fatalities of the conflict. As the British troops retreated toward Boston, they faced a new kind of warfare. Colonists used the landscape to their advantage, firing from behind stone walls and trees, turning the march into a desperate retreat for the professional British column. The Battle of Bunker Hill and the appointment of George Washington as commander-in-chief proved the colonies could organize a professional military response against one of the world's most powerful empires. By late 1775, a strange paradox emerged. Colonists were actively shooting at British troops, yet the public remained deeply divided over whether they were fighting for independence or simply trying to force the king to respect their rights. The final push came from the written word. Thomas Paine's Common Sense attacked the very concept of monarchy, providing the intellectual catalyst for a public still hesitant to break away. Paine's arguments reached thousands, transforming independence from a radical fringe idea into an urgent necessity for the survival of colonial rights. In July 1776, the final tie was severed. This broadside of the Declaration of Independence announced to the world that 13 colonies were now an entirely new political entity. The American Revolution emerged as a series of forced evolutions, a breaking point where a tightening imperial grip pushed loyal subjects into open rebellion. In the year 1763, there is no United States. Instead, along the eastern coast of North America, there are 13 distinct colonies. They are divided by geography, religion, and local economies. Yet they share one unifying trait. They speak English, trade under British law, and consider themselves proud subjects of King George III. But that relationship is about to face severe financial strain. This chart shows the massive spike in British national debt following 9 years of global conflict in the 7 Years' War, compared to the relatively tiny tax revenue generated from the American colonies. The British government has accumulated enormous debts fighting French forces and their indigenous allies. To London, the logic is straightforward. Since British taxpayers financed a war that secured the American frontier, the colonists should help pay for their own ongoing defense. To raise that revenue, Parliament passes the Stamp Act in 1765. The law required almost all printed materials in the colonies, newspapers, legal documents, and licenses, to carry a specific tax stamp, like these one-penny duties. Colonists pushed back immediately. They have already paid taxes to their own local assemblies and supplied soldiers for the war. They argue that Parliament, sitting thousands of miles away in London, has no legal right to impose taxes on people who have no elected representatives in that body. The resistance rallies around a clear legal argument: no taxation without representation. At this stage, protests and merchant boycotts are not demands for a new nation. In 1765, the colonists are actively trying to keep the British Empire intact. They are simply demanding what they believe are their traditional rights as Englishmen. When Parliament introduces a new series of duties in 1767, known as the Townshend Acts, colonial boycotts resume. British officials respond by sending armed troops into Boston. Placing soldiers inside a major civilian city creates a highly combustible atmosphere. Citizens and soldiers live side by side, and every argument in the street carries the threat of violence. On a freezing evening in March 1770, that threat becomes a reality. A crowd gathers near the Boston Custom House, shouting at British guards. As the chaos grows and objects are thrown, soldiers fire their weapons into the crowd, killing 5 colonists. Colonial leaders quickly harness the story. Paul Revere produces propaganda depicting British soldiers firing into a defenseless crowd. By explicitly listing the victims' names at the bottom, the engraving frames them as martyrs, shifting the conversation toward the direct threat of military power. 3 years later, the British East India Company is granted favorable conditions to sell tea directly to the colonies. Recognizing that buying the tea means accepting Parliament's authority to tax them, colonists refuse to let ships unload. In December 1773, thousands gather in Boston. Colonial protesters board 3 ships in the harbor and methodically destroy hundreds of chests of private company property. Furious at the destruction, Parliament passes the Coercive Acts, closing Boston Harbor and placing Massachusetts under strict military control. British leaders expect these punishments to isolate Boston and frighten the rest of the continent into submission. The opposite happens. Observing the suppression of Massachusetts, other colonies conclude that their own local governments and liberties are now at risk. This network map shows how colonial communities communicate. Through committees of correspondence, a protest in Boston quickly sparks debate in Philadelphia or Williamsburg. Information travels rapidly, allowing 13 separate colonies to coordinate boycotts and develop a shared political response. As diplomatic options fade, local militias begin stockpiling weapons. In April 1775, British troops march out of Boston to seize colonial military supplies in the town of Concord. Local resistance networks warn the countryside. At Lexington, the two sides meet. Shots are fired. Militiamen are killed. And the British column is repeatedly attacked by farmers and tradesmen during a bloody retreat back to Boston. By June, colonial forces entrench themselves on the hills overlooking the city. British commanders launch a massive assault. While the British eventually capture the position, they suffer devastating casualties. The Battle of Bunker Hill proves that disorganized local militias can stand in formation and fight a professional imperial army. The events create a bizarre political reality. The colonies are raising armies, hoarding their own ammunition, and actively killing British soldiers. Yet, officially, they still claim to be loyal subjects of King George III. In early 1776, an English immigrant named Thomas Paine publishes a pamphlet titled Common Sense. Addressed directly to the inhabitants of America, it attacks the very concept of monarchy, arguing that a distant island cannot logically rule a massive continent. Paine's accessible writing spreads through taverns and army camps, making the once radical idea of independence seem like a logical necessity. Inside the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, delegates realize that reconciliation has failed. They appoint a committee to draft a formal separation, assigning a young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson to write the first draft. Jefferson's document grounds authority in the consent of the governed, asserting government protects inherent rights. The text acts as a legal indictment, listing the king's violations, interfering with trade, taxes, and deploying forces, justifying the colonies as free and independent states. On July 4, 1776, Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence. By putting their names on this parchment, the delegates cross a legal line. They are no longer protesting citizens. They are open traitors rebelling against the British Crown. If they lose, they face the total loss of their property and execution for treason. The soaring ideals of the Declaration quickly collide with military disaster. In the summer of 1776, a massive British military fleet arrives in New York. The inexperienced Continental Army is vastly outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and suffers a series of crushing defeats. They are pushed out of New York and sent into a desperate retreat, bringing the rebellion dangerously close to total collapse. Through the freezing winter, General George Washington understands one critical fact. He does not need to win decisive battles immediately. He simply needs to keep his men alive. As long as the Continental Army exists, the revolution exists. On Christmas night, Washington leads his exhausted forces across the icy Delaware River. They launch a complete surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton. Capturing hundreds of prisoners, they secure an incredible, desperately needed victory. The victory at Trenton restores morale and proves the American forces can fight back. The Declaration of Independence provided the colonies with a new political identity, but that document was only words on paper. The actual survival of the United States relied entirely on the endurance of an army willing to fight through its darkest hour. If you look at this map of North America in 1763, you'll find 13 separate territories along the eastern coast. But Britain's victory secured massive new tracts of land stretching westward. The people living here proudly considered themselves subjects of King George III. But defending that new territory was incredibly expensive. Britain had racked up enormous debts to win the war, and London decided the colonists should help foot the bill. The colonists viewed the ledger differently. They had already supplied soldiers, resources, and local taxes to the war effort. They argued that because they had no elected representatives in Parliament, London had no legal authority to impose new taxes on them. British officials in London dismissed this argument entirely. They maintained that Parliament held absolute authority over the entire empire. This disagreement tore open a massive political question. If colonists wouldn't obey Parliament, and Parliament wouldn't recognize colonial assemblies, there was no agreed-upon authority. A debate over paying off war debt quickly became a debate over who had the right to make laws for the American continent. To force revenue collection, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, taxing printed materials, and later the Townshend Acts, placing duties on imported goods like glass, paper, and tea. The colonists responded with economics, not violence. Merchants organized widespread boycotts, refusing to buy British imports, while local newspapers published fierce arguments against the new laws. Britain answered by sending armed troops into Boston, stationing a standing military force in a major colonial city to enforce tax collection created deep suspicion and daily hostility between soldiers and civilians. On the cold evening of March 5, 1770, an argument in the streets spiraled out of control. A crowd threw objects at British sentries. In the chaos, soldiers fired their weapons, killing 5 colonists. Look at this engraving by Paul Revere. It shows a highly coordinated line of British troops slaughtering innocent people. It was an exaggeration of a chaotic brawl, but colonial leaders distributed it everywhere to convince the public that British military presence was a lethal threat. By using armed soldiers to enforce tax collection, the British government directly pushed everyday citizens toward organized, radical resistance. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act to bail out the British East India Company. In response, thousands gathered in Boston, and a group boarded 3 cargo ships, destroying hundreds of chests of private corporate property by throwing the tea into the harbor. London was furious. Parliament retaliated with the Coercive Acts, explicitly designed to crush Boston and legally isolate Massachusetts from the rest of the continent by completely closing its harbor and suspending its political system. But the punishment backfired. Other colonies saw that if Britain could dismantle the government of Massachusetts, no colonial government was safe. Rather than abandoning Boston, representatives from 12 colonies traveled to Philadelphia to form the First Continental Congress. The tension reached a breaking point in April 1775. British General Thomas Gage ordered his troops to march 20 miles inland to Concord to actively seize a stockpile of colonial weapons. Local militia networks were waiting. When the two sides met at Lexington, shots rang out. The British destroyed what supplies they could find in Concord, but on the long march back to Boston, thousands of armed colonists fired on the column, inflicting severe casualties. The political debate over taxes and representation was over. Men had bled on the roads of Massachusetts, and a continental war was fully underway. Even after the shooting started, most colonists still wanted to remain British subjects. Then, in January 1776, an immigrant named Thomas Paine published this short pamphlet, Common Sense. Written in clear, everyday language, it successfully argued that a continent should not be ruled by a distant island, making the radical idea of complete independence a mainstream demand. By July, the Continental Congress made the split official. If you look closely at the top of this printed broadside of the Declaration of Independence, you can see the formal adoption of a completely new identity, the United States of America. Yet below those famous words about liberty, a deep contradiction remained. The men who signed this document proclaimed universal equality and natural rights, while simultaneously upholding a system of legal slavery throughout the colonies. Signing the Declaration was a high-stakes philosophical gamble, and it meant nothing if the signers were captured and executed. To survive, the new nation now had to face the full, devastating military retaliation of the entire British Empire. That retaliation arrived quickly. In the summer of 1776, the inexperienced and underfunded Continental Army suffered a crushing defeat against British professional forces at the Battle of Long Island, forcing a desperate retreat across New York and New Jersey. General George Washington faced a difficult math problem. His forces were outgunned and outnumbered. He realized he didn't need to destroy the British Army to win the war. He just needed to keep the American army from being destroyed. But retreating indefinitely destroys morale. To keep his exhausted men from giving up, Washington desperately needed a psychological victory. On Christmas night, crossing the icy Delaware River, his forces surprised the enemy garrison at Trenton, capturing hundreds of prisoners and keeping the rebellion intact for another year. The strategy of endurance eventually yielded larger results. In late 1777, American forces defeated a major British army at Saratoga. This victory provided exactly the proof of viability that France was waiting for. They formally entered the war, bringing funding, troops, and a navy, turning a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. This strategy culminated at Yorktown, Virginia, in 1781. French naval forces blocked the British from escaping by sea, while Washington and his French allies surrounded them by land, trapping a massive British army and forcing their surrender. The colonies didn't win their independence by sweeping the British off the battlefield with overwhelming force. Instead, they won by simply outlasting them. By enduring years of devastating setbacks and fighting a war of attrition, 13 fractured territories managed to forge themselves into a single independent nation. In 1763, the British Empire stood as the dominant global power. Following their victory in the 7 Years' War, British leaders controlled vast new territories across North America. But that expansion came with a massive financial burden, an empire drowning in debt. To address these debts, Parliament decided that the American colonies should contribute more to the cost of their own defense. They introduced new taxes on imports, legal documents, and everyday goods like tea. Many colonists who had already provided soldiers and resources during the war viewed these taxes as a violation of their rights as English subjects, especially since they lacked elected representatives in London. The political friction turned violent. In 1770, British soldiers in Boston fired into a crowd, killing 5. Paul Revere produced this engraving, depicting them as executioners. The image became a powerful tool, turning local anger into a shared cause. By 1775, the relationship had reached a breaking point. At Lexington and Concord, local militias and British regulars exchanged the first gunfire of the conflict. As British troops retreated toward Boston, they were harassed by farmers and tradesmen firing from the cover of trees and stone walls. The rebellion had moved from protest to open war. In the summer of 1776, the Continental Congress took the ultimate political risk. This document, the Declaration of Independence, announced that the 13 colonies were no longer subjects of King George III. They were now 13 independent states. But the newly declared nation lacked nearly everything required to fight a war. They had no established navy, no stable currency, and no professional military. To defend their independence, they relied on inexperienced volunteers, facing a massive professional British armada that was already arriving in their harbors. The Declaration of Independence did not end the struggle. It made the stakes absolute. For the new United States to survive, this fractured rebellion had to find a way to endure against the most powerful military machine on Earth. the British response was swift and overwhelming. In New York, a massive British invasion force crushed the Continental Army, forcing George Washington into a humiliating and desperate retreat. His men fled across New Jersey, pursued by a professional army that appeared impossible to stop. By the end of 1776, the revolution was failing. Cold and hungry, many soldiers saw their enlistments nearing an end and planned to return home. Desertions increased, and it appeared the rebellion would collapse before the year was over. Washington realized a traditional victory, destroying the enemy, was unnecessary. By keeping his army alive, the British could never win. This strategy of attrition cost Britain a fortune. Avoiding a final defeat would eventually drain the empire's resources and political patience. To maintain morale, Washington needed a success. On Christmas night in 1776, he led his troops across the icy Delaware River to launch a surprise attack on a Hessian garrison at Trenton. The Americans captured hundreds of prisoners and vital supplies. This victory provided the psychological boost the army needed, convincing soldiers and civilians alike that the rebellion could survive another year of war. The strategy of endurance faced its harshest test during the winter at Valley Forge. Soldiers lived in crude log structures like this one, battling extreme cold, starvation, and disease. Many lacked shoes and blankets, leaving blood on the snow as they marched through the camp. The army spent those freezing months drilling under the leadership of Baron von Steuben. A Prussian military officer, Steuben standardized their tactics and taught the men to move as coordinated units, transforming the ragtag force into a professional army. To isolate New England, the British sent an army south to control the Hudson River. However, the wilderness worked against them. Dense forests and American militias harassing supply lines slowed their movement, until the British column was completely surrounded. At Saratoga in 1777, the British commander was forced to surrender his entire army. It was the most significant defeat the British had suffered since the war began. Saratoga provided the first major proof that Washington's strategy could succeed. The victory demonstrated to the world that the Americans possessed the organization and resilience necessary to defeat a professional British force. Following the victory at Saratoga, France formally recognized the United States and entered the war as an official ally. French leaders, who had been secretly sending supplies, now committed their navy and regular troops to the American cause. The conflict expanded further as Spain also declared war on Britain, seeking to reclaim territory lost in previous wars. This global pressure forced Britain to redistribute its military power. To defend its territories in the Caribbean, Europe, and India, the British government had to pull ships and soldiers away from the American coast, leaving their remaining forces in the colonies vulnerable. By 1781, this global overextension created a trap. British General Charles Cornwallis moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia, believing the coastal location would allow the British Navy to supply and protect him. Instead, he was surrounded. Washington and French land forces hemmed him in from the north and west, while a powerful French fleet secured the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off any possibility of a British naval rescue. With no way to escape or receive supplies, Cornwallis surrendered his entire command. This coordinated strike effectively ended large-scale military operations in North America and secured the independence of the United States. The United States was not built on battlefield dominance alone. Its survival was the result of a strategy that traded territory for time, used endurance to secure global alliances, and ultimately outlasted the will of the British Empire. In 1763, the eastern coast of North America was home to 13 distinct British colonies. There was no American flag and no concept of the United Nation. From the ports of New England to the southern plantations, these people considered themselves loyal subjects of King George III, bound by English law and British trade. That loyalty was tested after the 7 Years' War. While Britain had emerged victorious over France, the conflict left the empire with a massive mountain of debt. Leaders in London reached a simple conclusion. The colonies had benefited from British protection, so the colonies should help pay the bill. This financial decision triggered a deep ideological friction. To Parliament, their authority to tax the empire was absolute. But to many colonists, taxation without direct political representation was a violation of their basic rights as Englishmen. The 1765 Stamp Act turned this debate into a daily bureaucratic burden. Looking at these surviving one-penny stamps, you can see the reach of the policy. This wasn't a distant tariff. It was a physical requirement for every newspaper, legal document, and license in the colonies. Resistance eventually shifted from boycotts to direct destruction. In 1773, as depicted in this print, protesters in Boston boarded British ships and systematically threw hundreds of chests of tea into the harbor. It was a calculated strike against the East India Company and the authority of the Crown. Britain responded by passing the Coercive Acts, closing Boston's port and stripping Massachusetts of its political freedoms. The plan was to isolate the rebellious colony, but it had the opposite effect. Terrified that their own rights were next, 12 other colonies sent representatives to Philadelphia, forming the First Continental Congress to organize a unified response. By 1775, the colonial countryside was rapidly militarizing. Local intelligence networks tracked British troop movements, while citizen militias began stockpiling gunpowder and weapons in hidden warehouses and barns. On the night of April 18th, General Thomas Gage sent British troops on a secret mission to seize those supplies in Concord. But the secret was out. When the soldiers reached Lexington at dawn, they were met by armed locals. A chaotic exchange of gunfire followed, leaving 8 militiamen dead. The bloodshed at Lexington and Concord ended the political debate over taxes. The colonies were now locked in an armed conflict for survival. Even as the fighting intensified, the idea of total independence remained a radical outlier. That changed in early 1776 with the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. As shown on the original title page, Paine addressed the inhabitants of America directly, arguing that a continent shouldn't be ruled by a distant island, making total separation the only path forward. By July, the Continental Congress made it official. This handwritten header from the Declaration of Independence marks the moment the colonies claimed a new political identity. The document argued that governments exist only to protect the rights of the people, and if a government fails, the people have the right to abolish it. But the high ideals of the Declaration existed alongside a stark contradiction. While the document proclaimed that all men are created equal, the delegates left the institution of slavery intact, a decision that would haunt the new nation for generations. These new ideals were crushed on the battlefield. Soon after the Declaration, a massive British invasion force routed Washington's inexperienced army in New York. The Americans were forced into a desperate retreat across New Jersey, with the entire rebellion on the verge of collapse. Washington realized that a conventional victory was impossible against a professional global power. Looking at this portrait, we see the architect of a new strategy: endurance. Washington understood that he didn't need to destroy the British Army, he just needed to keep his own army alive until the cost of the war became too high for Britain to pay. To prevent his army from dissolving, Washington launched a high-stakes surprise attack on Christmas night, 1776. His men struggled through a freezing storm to cross the ice-choked Delaware River, securing a victory at Trenton that revived the army's morale. This pivotal moment proved the Revolution could still fight. Britain attempted to end the war in 1777 with a master plan to divide the colonies. As this map shows, General John Burgoyne led a massive force south from Canada along the Hudson River Valley, intending to sever New England from the resistance. The plan collapsed in the dense American wilderness. Burdened by long supply lines and constant militia attacks, Burgoyne's army was eventually surrounded at Saratoga. This image captures the moment of his surrender, a massive blow to British prestige and the most significant American victory to date. This victory brought France into the conflict as an official American ally. Britain suddenly faced a multi-front war against a major European rival, forcing them to defend their global empire from the Caribbean to India while managing a rebellion at home. In 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia. He believed the coastal position would allow him to be resupplied by the British Navy. He was unaware that he was being targeted by a coordinated American and French operation. Washington executed a decoy near New York, while the main American and French armies marched to Virginia. The trap finalized when a French fleet blocked the Chesapeake Bay. As this vector shows, they cut off Cornwallis's escape route and prevented British reinforcements. After weeks of heavy artillery bombardment, the Allied forces launched a nighttime assault on the British defensive redoubts. This illustration captures the intensity of that final push. Moving with outmoded muskets, the soldiers engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat to seize the fortifications. General Cornwallis finally surrendered on October 19, 1781. The loss of an entire army made the war too expensive and diplomatically complex for the government in London. The military defeat at Yorktown effectively broke the British Empire's will to continue the fight. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, forcing Britain to formally recognize the United States as an independent nation. The war was officially over. But the victors inherited a country in crisis. The new nation was burdened by massive war debts, lacked a functional central government, and remained divided by the unresolved issue of slavery. Winning this independence was only the preamble. George Washington's decision to resign his command and return to civilian life signaled that the military phase was over. The far more difficult experiment, building a stable, functioning republic based on the ideals of 1776, was just beginning. This is a map of the British dominions in North America, printed in 1772. It shows 13 distinct, divided colonies hugging the eastern seaboard, populated by people who were deeply loyal to the British Crown and celebrating their empire's recent military victories. But the 7 Years' War left Britain buried in debt. To balance the books, Parliament decided the American colonies should start paying for their own military defense. The colonists drew a hard line at new measures like the Stamp Act. They argued that because they had no elected representatives in Parliament, London had no legal authority to tax them. To them, taxation without representation was a direct violation of their traditional rights as Englishmen. In the beginning, nobody was trying to start a new country. The early resistance was an effort to preserve the old system, but that very effort accidentally ignited a continental crisis. When Parliament sent troops to Boston to enforce its new laws, the friction became lethal. Armed soldiers and frustrated civilians living side by side led directly to the gunfire of the Boston Massacre and the property destruction of the Tea Party. London struck back with the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston's port and stripping Massachusetts of its political rights. The goal was to isolate the troublemakers. Instead, the punishment terrified the other 12 colonies, pushing them to unite in mutual defense. By April 1775, British troops marched toward Concord to seize colonial weapons. The local militias were waiting. Shots rang out, and a planned military operation became a bloody retreat for the British through the forests and stone walls of Massachusetts. The old political relationship was dead. Colonial militias were killing soldiers of the world's most powerful empire. Yet the colonies still lacked a unified idea of what they were actually fighting to achieve. The objective shifted when Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense. He argued that begging a king for rights was a waste of time, and that the colonies had the resources to govern themselves. The goal moved from demanding British rights to demanding complete independence. In July 1776, the Continental Congress made it official. This is the original parchment of the Declaration of Independence, announcing a new nation built to protect natural rights. But a document didn't make the country real. These ink signatures belonged to men committing high treason. If the rebellion failed, they faced execution, and failure looked likely. Right after declaring independence, George Washington's underfunded army faced a massive British invasion force in New York. The Americans suffered devastating defeats and were forced into a desperate retreat. Facing destruction, Washington changed his approach. Looking at this visualization of the war's strategic math, Washington didn't need to win conventional battles. He only needed to keep his army intact. As long as the army survived, the cost of the war steadily depleted British resources. The war became an agonizing test of endurance. Success meant keeping an army alive through a freezing winter at places like Valley Forge, a strategic victory won through sheer survival. That endurance eventually paid off. In 1777, American forces captured an entire British army at Saratoga. This victory provided exactly the proof of viability that foreign powers were waiting for. France saw an opportunity to strike its old rival, formally allying with the United States. In this animated map, you can see British military assets siphoning away from the American coast to defend critical trade routes in the Caribbean, Europe, and India. The localized colonial dispute became a massive global conflict. By 1781, global pressure created a trap in Virginia. George Washington marched his infantry to Yorktown, while a powerful French fleet sealed off the Chesapeake Bay. The British army was cornered and forced to surrender. The colonies' stubbornness kept the rebellion alive until they could assemble a global coalition to stretch Britain to the breaking point. But victory introduced a new danger. By 1783, the Continental Army was exhausted, angry, and unpaid. Historically, this is the moment when victorious armies march on their own capitals, and generals install themselves as dictators. Instead, George Washington resigned his military commission. He voluntarily gave up power to the civilian government, cementing the rule that in this new republic, the military would serve the nation. This is the signature page of the 1783 Treaty of Paris. Below those red wax seals, the signatures of Adams, Franklin, and Jay secured formal British recognition of American independence and vastly expanded the new country's borders. But the reality behind the treaty was catastrophic. The economy was in ruins, and the national government was deliberately designed to be weak, incapable of collecting taxes or enforcing laws. Winning the war was the easiest part of the revolution. The immediate aftermath left the fragmented United States on the brink of political and economic collapse. That chaos forced leaders back to the drawing board. In 1787, delegates gathered for the Constitutional Convention to scrap the failing Confederation and engineer a federal system of checks and balances. Yet this new framework was built on a glaring contradiction. The nation championed universal natural rights while legally protecting the continued enslavement of hundreds of thousands of African Americans. The exclusions went further. Women were denied equal political standing, and the stroke of a pen in Paris meant that Native American nations faced immediate aggressive territorial displacement from a rapidly expanding American population. The revolution produced a fragile, contradictory ideological framework. It secured independence, but left the definition and reach of liberty for future generations to resolve. Imagine America in 1763. There is no United States, no president, and no American flag. Instead, 13 British colonies stretch along the Atlantic coast. Their inhabitants speak English, trade under British law, and remain loyal subjects of King George III. This map shows the outcome of the 7 Years' War. Britain emerged victorious, acquiring French territory east of the Mississippi and Spanish Florida. But this victory came with an enormous price. To manage their double territory and pay down a crushing national debt, British leaders looked to the American colonies for revenue. London introduced a series of taxes, including the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, arguing that since British troops defended the colonies should help pay the bill. Many colonists disagreed. They had no elected representatives in the British Parliament, and they believed that without representation, London had no legal right to impose these internal taxes. Resistance moved quickly from political debates to public demonstrations. In 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd in Boston, killing 5 colonists. 3 years later, protesters in Boston boarded British ships and destroyed hundreds of chests of tea to prevent the collection of a new duty. The British government responded with the Intolerable Acts, a military crackdown to restore order in Massachusetts. Instead of isolating the rebellion, the punishment united the colonies. By April 1775, local militias and British regulars exchanged the first shots of a war at Lexington and Concord. The disagreement over war debt reached a tipping point regarding who held the right to govern. The 13 colonies were no longer just arguing over taxes. They were beginning to see themselves as part of a shared political cause. In early 1776, a pamphlet called Common Sense began circulating through the colonies. Written by Thomas Paine, it attacked the institution of monarchy and argued that a small island should not rule an entire continent. His words helped transform independence from a radical idea into a serious political possibility. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. This document justified the rebellion by stating that governments exist only to protect the natural rights of the people. It was a formal rejection of the king's authority and the announcement of 13 new independent states. This chart compares the free colonial population to those held in bondage. While the Declaration proclaimed that all men are created equal, roughly 1/5 of the population remained enslaved. This contradiction between the language of liberty and the reality of slavery would remain a defining tension of the new nation. This paradox extended to the frontier. The same independence that promised land and opportunity to white settlers meant renewed conflict for indigenous nations. Many Native American tribes allied with Britain because they viewed American westward expansion as a direct threat to their sovereignty and their land. These revolutionary ideals challenged the old systems of inherited privilege. However, in practice, the benefits of the revolution were exclusive, leaving the questions of equality for enslaved people, women, and indigenous nations largely unresolved. By the summer of 1776, the ideological excitement of independence met a grim military reality. The Continental Army was inexperienced and poorly supplied. George Washington's forces faced the professional troops and dominant navy of the British Empire, suffering a series of defeats that nearly ended the rebellion. Washington realized he did not have to win every battle to win the war. He only needed to keep the American army alive. If the Continental Army could survive long enough to exhaust Britain's financial and political will, the empire might eventually give up the fight. This painting depicts the British surrender at Saratoga in 1777. The victory proved that American forces could defeat a major British army in the field. It was the turning point that convinced European powers that the American cause was a viable investment. Saratoga secured a formal alliance with France, which brought essential money, weapons, and naval support. The conflict was no longer a localized rebellion. It had become an international war that forced Britain to defend its interests across the globe. The alliance proved decisive at Yorktown in 1781. While American and French troops surrounded the British, a French fleet blockaded the Chesapeake Bay. Trapped without supplies or the hope of a naval rescue, General Cornwallis was forced to surrender. The strategy of endurance had succeeded. By outlasting the British military and securing powerful allies, the Americans had survived long enough to turn a long-shot rebellion into an established independence. This is the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783. In this document, Britain formally recognized the United States as an independent nation. The war was officially over, and the new country now controlled a vast territory stretching west to the Mississippi River. With the war won, George Washington took an unexpected step. He resigned his military commission and returned to civilian life. By voluntarily giving up power, he established the precedent that the United States would be a republic governed by law, not by a military dictator. However, the first years of peace were chaotic. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government was too weak to collect taxes, pay its debts, or resolve disputes between states. Economic instability and local rebellions led many to fear that the new nation would collapse into disorder. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to create a more stable framework. The resulting constitution sought to save the Union by creating a stronger federal government, while still attempting to protect the liberties they had fought for during the Revolution. This diagram shows the system of checks and balances established by the Constitution. To prevent any one person from becoming a tyrant, power is divided between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, with each branch given specific ways to limit the authority of the others. The American Revolution created an independent nation, but it did not create a finished one. The 1787 Constitution provided a structure for government, yet it left the country's deepest contradictions, like the existence of slavery and the scope of individual rights, unresolved. The Revolution had launched an experiment in self-rule, leaving the next generation to determine if a republic based on liberty could actually survive its own internal divisions.